November 885, 700 ships, maybe more. The sources can't even agree because the fleet was that massive. They sailed up the Seine like a moving city of death, demanding tribute from the greatest empire in Europe. And here's the impossible part. Between them and conquest stood a single island, 2 bridges, and a handful of towers manned by a few hundred defenders. The Vikings had crushed armies, sacked monasteries, and made kings pay ransoms for decades. Paris should have fallen in days. Instead, it held for 11 months. But here's the twist that'll make your blood boil. When the siege finally ended, the defenders won the battle. But the emperor paid the Vikings anyway and told them to go raid someone else. This is the story of how Charlemagne's empire learned that Vikings weren't just raiders anymore. They were patient, organized, and unstoppable. And more terrifying, their own leaders might betray them rather than fight. This is the Siege of Paris, 885. But to understand why this siege changed everything, you need to understand what came before. And what came before was a dead emperor and a dying dream. 814 AD, Charlemagne, the man who'd united Western Europe, crowned himself Roman emperor and built something that hadn't existed for 4 centuries, is dead. He leaves behind an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, a Christian Rome reborn. His heirs inherit the most powerful realm in Europe. Fast forward 70 years. By 885, that empire is a corpse being picked apart by vultures. Charlemagne's grandsons divided the realm, then fought over the pieces, then divided again. The man supposedly in charge now? Charles the Fat. And the name tells you everything. He rules a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms held together by tradition and prayers. The empire isn't expanding anymore. It's barely surviving. And the Vikings? They noticed. Here's what made the Northmen so terrifying. They didn't need roads. They had rivers. And rivers in 9th century Europe weren't borders. They were highways. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine. Every major waterway was an invitation. A longship drew maybe 3 feet of water. It could sail upstream for hundreds of miles, appear at a monastery or market town with 0 warning, and vanish before any army could respond. The Seine was the worst. Picture it, a river that cuts straight through the heart of Francia, flowing from the interior all the way to the English Channel. Paris sits roughly 200 miles inland. A Viking fleet could cover that distance in days. Not weeks. Days. This wasn't warfare. This was terrorism with logistics. And the Franks? They taught the Vikings exactly the wrong lesson. 845 AD, the first time Vikings sailed up the Seine to Paris. King Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson, watched a fleet of 120 ships approach his capital. What did he do? He paid them. 7,000 pounds of silver to go away. The Vikings took the money. They left. And they remembered. They remembered that Frankish kings would rather pay than fight. They remembered that silver was easier than slaughter. They remembered that this empire, for all its crosses and crowns, was soft. So they came back, again and again. 856, 861, 865. Each time the pattern repeated. Vikings arrive, Vikings threaten, Franks pay, Vikings leave. The technical term for these payments was danegeld. The practical term was protection money. And like all protection rackets, it only encouraged more predators. By 885, an entire generation of Franks had grown up watching their kings hand silver to Northmen. They'd learned to expect betrayal. They'd learned that imperial armies might not come. They'd learned that survival meant building walls and praying because their rulers couldn't be trusted to protect them. But Paris was different. Look at a map. Paris sits on an island in the Seine, the Île de la Cité. Not a big island, maybe 1,000 feet long, but an island is a natural fortress. Water on all sides, Limited approaches, easy to defend if you're willing to fight. And someone had been willing to plan ahead. 2 bridges connected the island to the riverbanks, the Grand Pont to the north, the Petit Pont to the south. Simple wooden bridges, except at each end stood a fortified tower, stone and timber strongpoints that turned the bridges into choke points. Any ship trying to pass had to get through those towers first. This was Carolingian engineering. Not glamorous, not famous, but brutally effective. The bridges blocked the river, the towers defended the bridges, and as long as those towers stood, no Viking fleet could sail past Paris to raid the wealthy lands beyond. Paris wasn't just a city, it was a lock on the Seine. The last lock. Break it, and everything upstream was defenseless. The Vikings knew this, the Franks knew this, and in November 885, both sides knew that this time would be different. No more quick raids, no more easy payments. This would be a siege. November 885. Seine fills with sails. Imagine standing on the walls of Paris. You've heard the stories all your life. Viking raids, burned monasteries, slaughtered monks. But stories are abstract. This is real. The fleet stretches so far you cannot see its end. 700 ships, the chronicles say. Maybe more. Abbot of Saint-Germain, a monk who survived the siege and wrote its history, admits he couldn't count them. No one could. The river itself seemed to transform into wood and iron and death. And the men on those ships? Tens of thousands. The estimates vary wildly, anywhere from 30,000 to 40,000 warriors. Even the conservative numbers are terrifying. Paris had maybe 200 defenders, maybe 400 if you count everyone who could hold a weapon. Do the math. That's roughly 100 Vikings for every Parisian defender. The fleet anchors. 2 men come forward to negotiate. Siegfried and Sinrik, Viking warlords who'd raided Francia for years. They know the game. They've played it before. Sail up. Threaten. Collect payment. Leave. Simple. They approach the city with a straightforward demand: tribute and free passage. Pay us silver. Let us through the bridges. We'll raid Burgundy instead of burning Paris. Everyone wins. Except this time, someone says no. 2 men stood between the Vikings and their payday, and neither was a king. Count Odo, warrior, noble, the man responsible for defending Paris in the emperor's absence. He wasn't royalty, but he had something the royals lacked. He was willing to fight. Beside him, Bishop Goslin. And forget everything you think you know about medieval bishops. Goslin wasn't some frail priest clutching a Bible. He was a political operator, a builder, a leader who'd spent years preparing Paris for exactly this moment. The fortified towers, his project, the defensive preparations, his vision. When Siegfried demanded tribute, these 2 men gave an answer that shocked the Vikings. Not one coin, not one ship passes. Think about what that meant. For 40 years, Frankish leaders had paid. Every single time. The Vikings had built their entire strategy around the expectation of tribute. It was reliable, it was profitable, it was how this worked. And now 2 men, a count and a bishop, were breaking the pattern. The Vikings didn't believe it at first. Surely this was posturing. Surely the silver would come. They'd seen Frankish courage before. It always crumbled. But the bridges stayed closed. The towers stayed manned. And the message became clear. Paris would fight. November 26th, 885. The first assault begins. Now here's what should terrify you. The Vikings didn't just rush the walls like barbarians. They came with siege engines, battering rams, catapults, mobile shelters called tortoises to protect attackers from arrows. This wasn't a raid. This was Roman-style siege warfare executed by Northmen who'd learned from decades of attacking fortified positions. The primary target, the northeast tower guarding the Grand Pont. Take the Ide Tower, control the bridge, open the river. Simple strategy, brutal execution. Wave after wave hit the tower, arrows darkened the sky, stones crashed against timber, rams hammered the base while Vikings climbed with ladders, axes swinging, shields raised against the desperate defenders above. And those defenders? Outnumbered beyond reason, exhausted within hours, watching friends die on walls they couldn't abandon. But they held. Odo was everywhere, not commanding from safety, fighting on the walls. Contemporary accounts describe him hurling javelins, swinging swords, physically throwing attackers off ladders. This wasn't leadership by delegation. This was a count who understood that if the men saw him bleed beside them, they might find the courage to die beside him. The first assault failed, then the second, then the third. The Vikings pulled back, regrouped, and tried something different. Fire. They loaded ships with burning materials, sent them downstream toward the wooden bridges. If they couldn't break the towers, they'd burn them. The defenders watched the fire ships approach, floating infernos drifting toward the only structures keeping Paris alive. Goslin had prepared for this, too. Chains across the river, hooks to catch burning vessels, crews ready to push them away before they could ignite the bridges. The fire ships failed, barely. Close enough to taste the smoke, close enough to know the next attempt might succeed. January 886, the Vikings try again. This time, the river itself becomes a weapon. Winter rains swell the Seine. The water rises and rises. The Petit Pont, the smaller southern bridge, starts to strain. Wood creaks, supports groan. Then it breaks. The flood doesn't just damage the bridge, it sweeps away a section entirely. And the tower at the far end? Suddenly cut off. 12 defenders trapped on the wrong side of a broken bridge, surrounded by an army of thousands. 12 men, alone. No retreat, no reinforcement, possible. The Vikings see the opportunity. They swarm the isolated tower. And here's where the story becomes legend or tragedy, depending on how you see it. Those 12 men fought. They knew they were dead. No rescue was coming. The bridge was gone. But they held that tower for hours. Hours. 12 against thousands, buying time for repairs that might never save them. The Vikings offered surrender. The defenders refused. Every single one of them died. The chronicles don't record their names. We don't know who they were, soldiers, citizens, men who simply refused to yield. But their sacrifice bought something priceless. Time. Time to rebuild. Time to reinforce. Time for Paris to survive another day. February 886. The siege enters its grinding phase. The Vikings can't break through. The Parisians can't break out. Both sides settle into something worse than battle. Waiting. The Vikings shift strategy. If they can't storm Paris, they'll starve it. The blockade tightens. Raiding. Parties sweep the countryside, burning farms, seizing livestock, cutting supply lines. Every week less food enters the city. Every week the defenders grow weaker. And now the real enemy arrives. Not Vikings. Disease, cramped conditions, contaminated water, bodies that can't be properly buried. Fever sweeps through Paris. Men who survived the assaults die shivering in their beds. The garrison shrinks, not from battle, but from sickness no wall can stop. Then the worst blow falls. Bishop Goslin, the architect of the defense, the leader who'd prepared Paris for this moment, dies. The chronicles blame exhaustion and disease. After months of fighting, planning, praying, his body simply gave out. Paris loses its spiritual heart. The man who'd said, "Hold," from the beginning is gone. Odo remains. Alone at the top now, every decision his, every failure his, every death his responsibility. The count who refused tribute carries the weight of a city on his shoulders, and still no help comes. Where is the emperor? Where is Charles the Fat with the imperial army? Messengers had been sent months ago. The empire knows Paris is dying, The empire does nothing. Weeks become months. Months become seasons. Spring arrives, then summer, and Paris keeps holding, not because victory seems possible, but because surrender seems worse. The defenders aren't fighting for the empire anymore. They've learned what the empire is worth. They're fighting for each other, for the man beside them on the wall, for the families huddled behind them, for the simple, stubborn refusal to prove the Vikings right. But hope is dying. Then, in October 886, 11 months after the siege began, scouts report movement on the horizon. Banners, cavalry, infantry. The imperial army has finally arrived. Charles the Fat has come to save Paris. 11 months. 11 months of blood and fire and starvation and disease. 11 months of watching friends die on walls that should have fallen in days. 11 months of waiting for an empire that seemed to have forgotten them. And now, finally, salvation. The imperial army spreads across the horizon, thousands of fresh soldiers, cavalry, the banners of Charles the Fat, Emperor of the Franks, heir to Charlemagne himself. The defenders on the walls, gaunt, exhausted, reduced to a fraction of their original number, must have wept with relief. The Vikings see the army too, and for the first time in 11 months, they face a choice. Fight a fresh imperial force after a year of failed assaults, or negotiate. Everyone knows what happens next. The decisive battle. The emperor crushes the Viking horde. Paris is saved. The siege becomes a triumph. The defenders are heroes. Everyone knows. Everyone is wrong. Charles the Fat looks at the Viking army. He looks at the battered walls of Paris. He looks at the strategic situation. A weakened enemy. An exhausted defender. An opportunity to end the Viking threat on the Seine forever. And he decides to pay. Not just pay. He pays the Vikings approximately 700 pounds of silver. Some sources say more. He gives them free passage past Paris. And here's the part that should make you sick. He tells them to sail upstream and raid Burgundy instead. Read that again. The emperor pays the enemy, then gives them permission to attack his own people, just different people, someone else's problem. The defenders of Paris watched this happen. Imagine Odo on those walls. 11 months of holding the impossible line. Goslin dead, half the garrison dead. Starvation, disease, fire, blood. All of it meaning something because the emperor would come and finish the fight. And the emperor came. And the emperor paid. Everything they suffered. Everything they sacrificed. The 12 men who died alone on that broken tower. The bishop who worked himself to death. The soldiers who chose combat over surrender, again and again, because they believed the empire was worth defending. None of it mattered. The Vikings got their silver anyway. They got their passage anyway. They got everything they would have gotten if Paris had fallen on day one. The siege was a victory, and the victory was worthless. Why? Why would Charles do this? Historians have debated for centuries. Some argue he was weak, physically ill, mentally exhausted, incapable of decisive action. Some say he was pragmatic. Why risk battle when payment achieves the same result? Some suggest political calculations. Burgundy wasn't his core territory, so letting Vikings raid there cost him little. But here's what matters more than why. What it meant. To the Vikings, the message was clear. Persistence works. Pressure works. Even if you can't break the walls, even if the defenders hold, even if you lose assault after assault, wait long enough, and the Franks will pay. They always pay. The siege of Paris proved that Frankish courage could hold, and it proved that Frankish leadership would still betray that courage. To the Franks, the message was devastating. Your rulers will not protect you. Your emperor will sell your sacrifice for convenience. The man who should be Charlemagne's heir has become Charlemagne's shame. And to the defenders of Paris, to Odo and the survivors who'd held the impossible line, the message was revolution. 888 AD, 2 years after the siege, Charles the Fat is deposed, not killed, just removed, set aside like a broken tool. The nobles of the empire look at him and see a man who paid Vikings to raid his own people. They see weakness incarnate. They're done. And who do they choose to replace him? Who becomes the new king of West Francia? Odo, the Count of Paris, the man who held the walls, not because of his bloodline, not because of tradition, because he fought, because when the empire failed, he didn't. The siege of Paris made Odo a legend, and that legend made him a king. But the damage was done. The Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne's dream of a united Christian Europe, never recovered. Within a generation, it fragments into the kingdoms that will eventually become France and Germany. The imperial idea survives in name only. Real power flows to local strongmen, counts and dukes who can actually defend their territories. Because that's the lesson of 885. The empire won't save you. The emperor won't fight for you. If you want to survive, build your own walls. Train your own soldiers. Trust your own lord, not some distant monarch who'll sell you for silver. The Vikings learned too. They learned that the Seine was defensible, that fortified bridges worked, that determined defenders could hold choke points against any fleet. So they adapted. They stopped trying to raid past Paris and started settling. 911 AD, 25 years after the siege, a Viking leader named Rollo negotiates with the Frankish king, not for tribute, for land. The king grants him territory at the mouth of the Seine, a place for Northmen to settle permanently. They call it Normandy, land of the Northmen. 150 years later, a descendant of those settlers, William, Duke of Normandy, crosses the English Channel and conquers a kingdom. The Vikings who couldn't break Paris eventually produced the man who broke England. But that's another story. Here's what the siege of Paris really taught. Before 885, Vikings were raiders. Terrifying, yes. Destructive, absolutely, but temporary. They came, they burned, they left. A storm that passes. After 885, Vikings were something else. Patient, organized, capable of sustaining operations for months, even years. They weren't just raiders anymore. They were conquerors who happened to prefer payment over battle. And worse, Frankish rulers might not fight them, might never fight them, might always choose silver over steel, letting someone else burn so they could keep their comfort. Paris held. The defenders won. Every assault failed. Every fire ship was stopped. Every ladder was thrown down. By any military measure, the siege was a Frankish victory. But victories don't matter if your leaders won't claim them. The empire Charlemagne built didn't die from Viking axes. It died from Viking patience and Frankish cowardice. It died because an emperor looked at heroes and saw an inconvenience. It died because tribute was easier than battle, and no one at the top was willing to pay the real price of survival. The Franks learned to fear Vikings. That fear was rational. The Northmen were everything the legends claimed: fierce, relentless, adaptable. But after Paris, the Franks learned to fear something else, something worse, their own leaders, and that fear shaped Europe for centuries. The primary source for the siege is Abbo of Saint-Germain's Bella Parisiaque Urbis, an eyewitness account written in Latin verse. The Annales Vedestini provides additional details. Both agree on the essential horror. Paris held, and the emperor paid anyway. If you want to know what happened to Odo's kingdom, to Normandy, to the slow death of Carolingian Europe, that's coming. One question before you go. If you were on those walls, 11 months in, and you watched your emperor hand silver to the men who'd tried to kill you, would you have stayed loyal? Or would you have remembered?